Hello and welcome to A Day in the Life. My name is Fred Hacker. I'm your community producer and the host of this program, and I'm delighted to welcome you to yet another edition of our program. This is program number 115 in our series, and our sponsor for the season, once again, our great friends at Bales Dishaw Holloway RBC Dominion Securities in Midland. And special thanks to Kathy Bales, to Michelle Dishaw, and to Jeff Holloway for their continuing support of this program. This particular edition of A Day in the Life is being sponsored by HGR Graham Partners, lawyers in Central Ontario, and we thank them and always encourage our viewers to support those who support us. Well, I am delighted to introduce somebody who has at least one thing in common with me, and that is we were both born in Midland. My guest is Joe Roberts, a fascinating story. Joe, I won't give any of it away, but welcome and thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me on the program, Fred. It's an honor to be here.
Well, as I mentioned, your early beginnings and my early beginnings are similar, but Joe, you have had a remarkable life, the highest of highs and unfortunately the lowest of lows, and it's a very inspirational story. And our program, as I've told you, Joe, is really designed to inspire those who are joining us, and I know they'll be inspired as you tell your story. So, tell us a little bit about your parents and your siblings, first of all.
Well, was born, as you mentioned, was born in Midland. I got an older brother and a younger sister. We're separated by 3 years. And I think if we go back a little bit further, my family originally came to Midland because my grandpa, after World War II, with his connection to the CRTC and radio broadcast, applied for a CRTC license and got the Midland radio station. So AM 1240, I believe it was, CKMP was Grandpa's business. Mom worked there. Dad worked at the local seatbelt factory, Dacor Metal, I think they called it back then. And I grew up in the little white house beside the water tower on Dominion Avenue. And by all rights, Fred, pretty normal, typical, middle class upbringing.
What was the family life like in the very early days, Joe?
You know what? And I've shared this story a lot of times. It was like a sitcom. It really was. It was like the Leave It to Beaver show, which maybe dates me a bit, but it was, I just remember my early years being very idyllic. I had a tree fort in the backyard, I had a little dog named Angus, older brother, younger sister, rode my bike behind MSS school. And, my best friend was Darren Morrison, who lived on the corner. And, things were good. Things were really awesome. We had summer vacations. We didn't have a lot, but we had family. Like, we didn't have a lot of material wealth, but we had a very strong connection to family, community. Yeah, it was nice. It was good.
And Joe, something happened when you were 8 that changed that.
Yeah, life lifed me, and as it does, all of us, at some point you're wandering down the road of life, minding your own business, and bam. What happened is I remember, I have a memory. Father Tony from the local parish, local Catholic church, came knocking on the door really late and informed my mom that our father had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. And literally overnight, I lost Dad, Mom lost the love of her life, and our family lost our income. And so I just remember it being really devastating. But what I remember about that night is the shrill that came from my mom, that came out of my mom. And Dad was really young. Like, it was hard for me to imagine at 8 years old, but Dad was only 35 years old. Like, he was really, really young. And that left a massive void in our family. And really, it sort of changed the trajectory of everything.
Yeah. Your mom did remarry.
Yeah. Yeah. And relatively quickly. And I think part of it had to do with maybe, I don't know, maybe economic insecurity. I don't know, but she began dating relatively like about a year or so after Dad had passed. And the fellow who came along next was, he seemed great. I always joke the interview process went real well, but as time went on, his true colors began to show, and he couldn't have been more opposite. My dad was the kind of guy who was a baseball coach, hockey coach, family vacations. My stepfather didn't seem to be all that interested in being a dad. And on top of that, there was some other stuff going on too.
Now, in your childhood, and by the way, I'm going to mention your book, Push for Change, and I've read about your early life in that. You were pretty entrepreneurial as a kid.
I was. Here's the thing. I was born between 7th and 8th, and 8th was a pretty busy street, and I wasn't allowed to go up to 8th to have a Kool-Aid stand, but I was allowed to ride my bike. And I remember I had this Kool-Aid stand, but I couldn't get anybody to the stand because I'm on this, little street with no traffic. So I rode my bike around the corner, yelling out Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid, at 10 cents a glass, or 5 cents a glass. And Mr. Cannell, who lived down around the corner, sent his son, Mike, to come and buy all my Kool-Aid because he couldn't get any sleep in the afternoon. And that's one story. And another one is I went door to door selling used Christmas cards. And this was preschool. So I would have been like 4 or 5 years old. So I always had a penchant for, wanting to find some way to, whether it was raking leaves or shoveling driveways. And I think it was really good that my parents instilled in me at a very young age. If you want something, you want a new bike or you want that toy, go out and earn the money.
Yeah. Now, you were in school, obviously, when the new dad came into your life, but you didn't stay in school for all that long, Joe.
No, well, the second part of the story with the remarriage is that my stepfather was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so, I went from a father who would say things like, I love you, you can be and do anything, to a man who would say things like, you're dumb, you're stupid, you'll never amount to anything. And so I had a fractured sense of self-worth. I continued through school, but I started to experiment at a pretty young age with drugs.
How old were you, Joe?
I was 9 years old, actually, about a year after Dad died, and it was in Woodland Park, just up in near where my grandpa and grandma lived. Yeah. And the older kids were, experimenting, and I joined. Funny thing is, I didn't join because I was curious about using drugs. I joined more to fit in. You see, I wanted to be connected to these older boys. I went home under the influence, and for the first time in my life since my dad died, I felt safe and protected.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so as time went on, by the time I was 14, 15, I was rebellious. At 16, I dropped out of school. At 15 years old, I left home, and my life really began to unravel.
So when you left home, you were 15, as I understand, but you tried to stay in school. So obviously that had been instilled in you by your parents, the importance of education.
I think it was, I think the importance of education came from my mom. And there was also a fear of what was on the other side of that. When I left the house, I did so like tens of thousands of young people do every year. Family conflict drove me out. I didn't really have a plan. I just had, the clothes on my back, and out into the world I went. So I was very vulnerable. I was couch surfing. But I knew that I needed to continue my studies. And so I tried to sort of balance, living on my own and going to school. But after a while, I had this early childhood trauma at the beginnings of a substance abuse problem. It just became too difficult, and school eventually dropped off. By the way, by this time, I was now living in Barrie. So we had moved from Midland in the late 1970s, 1978, 79-ish, and we moved to Barrie. And that's where, I left home. I found myself couch surfing and getting into sort of more and more precarious situations.
Were you living in a home, or did you have an apartment, or what was your accommodation?
Well, initially, I had worked with a gentleman at the Barrie Flea Market, and he provided me a room. Um, but in the beginning, I would describe where I was as someone with housing insecurity. Initially, I was couch surfing at a few friends' places, and then I would have a room for a little while, and then I wouldn't. And that's just sort of the nature. I would later find out when you actually study the research, this is the nature of youth homelessness. It's invisible. At that point in my life, I was incredibly vulnerable and, sort of at the forefront of all kinds of risk. And I just sort of muddled through. But yeah, in the beginning, I had, couch surfing, and then I would have an apartment for a week or two, a month, maybe 2 months, and then I wouldn't. And that carried on for a number of years like that.
Now there was a girl, Joe. Tell us about the girl.
The girl. Well, my teen years were really turbulent and tough. And I know a lot of people can relate to this. And, I had trouble at home. I had a great relationship with mom. But the one shining piece in my life was a gal I was dating in grade 10. And I was head over heels for this gal. And, we had dated for over a year, which is a lifetime when you're a 17-year-old, right? But what happened is, as my drug use and lifestyle became more and more erratic and dangerous and unpredictable, she sat me down one day and said, I really believe in you. Like, I see who you are, but I'm going in a different direction in life. And just like that, the relationship dissolved. And I remember being really probably more devastated than someone else, because this was just another abandonment. This was another person in my life who I loved or depended upon, who was not going to be there for me now.
There was a bit of a spiral followed that then, Joe. Can you tell us?
Yeah, well, it was sort of that relationship was sort of had a little bit of built-in guardrails in my life.
Yeah.
Even though my life was progressing in the wrong direction, with that relationship out of the way, yeah, I just sort of all bets were off, and my addiction and my behavior began to escalate. And in the midst of all this, I was now sort of wearing my welcome out in that small little town of Barrie, and I decided I needed a change of venue. And I don't know if you remember, but back in those days, you could go anywhere in Canada for $99 on the Greyhound. And so I went down to Bay Street in Toronto, and I got a one-way ticket to Vancouver. It was 1986. The World's Fair was on, and I thought, if I just go out to Vancouver, everything will be different. The only problem is I packed all my problems with me. And after 4 or 5 days, I landed in Vancouver. And I remember I was in this little park, and I was filled with aspiration. It was like the opening credits to the Mary Tyler Moore Show, where she throws her hat in the air, But what was waiting for me was a world of hurt, because now I was a small town kid in this city that was filled with danger and predation.
So where did you live, Joe? What did you do when you got there? What was your lifestyle?
Well, when I first got out there, you got to understand my age and sort of where I was at with the trajectory of my addiction. I was drinking and, smoking grass, and I wasn't doing anything particularly dangerous. And when I landed there, I got it was that insecure rooming house kind of deal where I had a place for a week or two, or we met some friends and it was staying on their floor. And so over the next, several months, things were fairly okay, but it was summertime. The challenge was my drug consumption changed dramatically. And I went from drinking and smoking marijuana to experimenting with cocaine and heroin intravenously. And so that day that I celebrated in that park with that, aspiration, little did I know at that time that I'd actually be eventually living in that park. And over the next several years, I struggled with addiction, I struggled with mental health, and I struggled with chronic poverty. And in fact, at my lowest point, I was one of those kids you see pushing a shopping cart, collecting cans and bottles.
Joe, you also, based on the book, had some interfaces in the criminal world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of that. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Fred.
Petty crime?
Yeah, most of it. I was a nuisance to law enforcement, not a threat to society. You know what I mean? I was that guy who was struggling to maintain a drug problem. And so with that came petty theft, shoplifting, possession of drugs. Interestingly, once my recovery process began, I went 2 decades. Well, it's almost 3 decades without any kind of negative law enforcement whatsoever. So, the problems that I had legally were directly attributed to. That's not to excuse the inappropriate behavior, because it was uncalled for. But yeah, at the time I was a kid looking for my next hustle to support a drug dependency. And so, yeah, I would get into periodic trouble with law enforcement, find myself locked up for, a week or 2 or a month. And it was this sort of revolving door, but it really had more to do with my addiction than it had to do with my moral compass.
Yeah. Where did you eat? How did you get clothing? What was your means of support?
Well, the kindness of others predominantly. It's funny, I share this story in various different forms all over the world. And I'm an example of a community investment gone well. So I was supported by, the Salvation Army. I was supported by soup kitchens. I was supported by social workers, healthcare workers. I had interaction with every kind of, police, fire, ambulance, health, emergency rooms, shelter systems, soup kitchens, food lines, the food banks, all of those. And so I was a heavy user of those social services. I was on welfare when I could, when I could get it. But it just, I was really at the mercy of other people. And a lot of times when things were really bad, I was also, highly vulnerable. And so it's interesting that the people that I might have had a bone to pick with were actually there to help support me. And so, when my bio gets read, or, people see these awards on the back of the wall, there's a bit of a false narrative there. I'm here today because of over 10,000 people. My story isn't that I got a haircut and pulled up my socks. I'm here today because people were there to provide stepping stones for me to find my possibility.
Yeah. Joe, you tell a story about a pair of boots that's very touching.
Yeah, well, when I hit bottom in 1989, I was at my worst, and I was sitting on a park bench, going through withdrawal. And the only way I can describe withdrawal is it's like the worst flu you've ever had in your life, times 100, with the knowledge that $10 makes it go away. And you think about it, if you had COVID and you knew $10 would make it go away, wouldn't you spend the $10, right? So caught in that, cycle of addiction, I needed $10, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't want to steal or rob because that wasn't who I was. And I came up with what I thought was the best idea in the world. And I walked across the street. I got up off a park bench. I walked across the street into a bar, and I sold the only thing I had in the world that was worth anything, and that was the boots off my feet. And I remember walking out of that bar, and it was just before Christmas in 1989. And I remember that my foot hit that cold concrete sidewalk in downtown Vancouver. And I remember asking the question, how did a good kid from Midland, end up on the 100 block East Hastings Street? And, I believe that was the day when, everything changed. And that was a tough day.
There's a guy came into your life named Gus, I guess one of the 10,000. Tell us about Gus.
Well, about 3 weeks before this happened, I was sitting on that same bench, or in that same little park. It's called Pigeon Park. It's in the epicenter of the downtown east side. And this elderly gentleman was sitting beside me, and I got to know him mostly because I wanted, to ask him for a couple of dollars. I was panhandling him. He gave me a couple of dollars, but he gave me something more. I remember him looking at me with these beautiful, bright eyes that were filled with, joy and love and compassion. And he said to me, he says, Joe, he says, you got this homeless addiction thing going on. He says, but there's so much more to you than you can see.
Wow.
For the first time in my life, someone, other than my mom and dad, spoke to my potential. He saw past my selfish exterior. He saw past my dirty clothes, my broken teeth, my scruffy beard, my matted hair, and he spoke to my potential. And he said, there's more to you than you can see. Interestingly, that's actually become a mantra of mine over the last 30 years. And it's something I teach. It's something I preach. It's something that I try to live in my life every single day.
You started, I guess you hit bottom.
Yeah.
Probably the best way to describe it. And at that point, you reached out to your mother of all people.
Well, yeah. And before that, on that street with those sock feet, I was truly at the bottom. It's interesting, when COVID hit, 18 months ago, I found myself in very familiar emotional territory. I remember because I've been in a bad spot, and that fear and that despair and that hopelessness. On the day I sold my boots, I remember I reached out and I cried out for help, and I said a little prayer on that street corner. And I said, I said, God, if you give me a second chance, I promise I'll make the most of the opportunity and I'll do something to help others. Well, the following day, I walked into this soup kitchen. It was run by the Salvation Army. And in there was some folks, a guy who knew me really well, and he helped connect me with my mom. And I asked Mom for a second chance. And I have to tell you, it didn't just come easily for me either, because I had burned my mom so many times. My mom and I were close, but I taxed that, but she said she agreed, and so I ended up going back to Ontario and staying with her in her home in Midhurst, Ontario, and began slowly putting my life back together.
Tell us a little about that process, Joe. How do you go about putting your life back together when you've been so far down?
Well, it wasn't easy, and it sort of was two stages. So the great thing about my mom is that she never gave up on me. And she's one of those people. There's Gus and Mom, and in essence, what Mom provided was kind of like a housing first strategy. She gave me a place to land, a place where I could have access to a clean bed and laundry and 3 squares, and a removal from an environment, the downtown east side, that was killing me. Problem is, Mom wasn't a social worker, so she didn't know how to really address my substance abuse. Now, I was away from the hard drugs, but I still continued to drink and pill, do pharmaceuticals. And one night, things got very, very bad. And she came into my room, and I was suicidal, because that was a pattern of mine. I would get intoxicated and become very despondent. And I struggled. When I used drugs, I struggled with mental health. And what she saw frightened her enough to call the OPP, because sitting on my bed beside me was a loaded handgun. So the OPP were called, and I believe that, again, this was one of those defining days in my life, because knowing what I know today about those kinds of interactions, it really could have gone bad for me. It could have gone bad like that. But the officer on the call, Constable Scott McLeod, he practiced a different kind. He used his communication skills to diffuse a really dangerous situation. And instead of that ending poorly for me, I got a ride to Royal Victoria Hospital in Barrie, where they began to work with me in the mental health clinic, which then led to a referral to a detox facility, and then entrance into a full residential treatment program. What's worth talking about in that story is that it's an example of what happens when the police get it right. And that night, Scotty got it right. And interestingly, we become friends, and I've shared that story lots over the last few years.
Yeah, and it's a touching story because, as you say, it's a volatile situation when he walks in and sees you with a loaded gun.
Yeah, and knowing what I know today about, because I've since then built a very strong relationship with police all across North America, is that the Scotty was 25 years ahead of the mental health bell curve, and he used his communications skills. And in that split second, it's funny, when he was talking to the CBC about the story, he said, "I didn't see a man who was a threat. I saw a kid who was in trouble."
Yeah.
And I treated him with empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just, it's one of those really great endings.
It is. Now, from there, you went on back to school at the age of 24.
Yeah, 24 years old. After 6 months in treatment, my counselor tricked me into going back to school. And I say he tricked me because there's no way I would have done that. I think the great thing that good leaders do is they get people to do things out of their comfort zone. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And so he tricked me. The carrot that he dangled for me was that I would get 6 months of secure housing. So my housing was secure if I applied and went back to college. And so I did. I found out, years later that was already secure. He needed something to encourage me to actually go to. And here's why. I thought I was stupid all my life. I thought I was dumb. Yeah. And something beautiful happened at Loyalist College in Belleville, Ontario. I started to apply myself. I started to do well. I started to come into my own. I started to get A's and B's. And after 3.5 years, I graduated with a 3.94 GPA.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, there, another one of your heroes, another one of the cast of 10,000 appeared, and I think we should mention him.
Yeah. Well, I had a teacher who wouldn't give up on me. And we went into the winter semester and I wanted to quit. It's not that I wasn't doing well, it's just I had anxiety about school. And Tom Thorne, I went into his office and I said, "Tom, I want you to sign this paper." And he said, "What's this all about?" And I said, I'm quitting. He said, "Go home, think about it, take Friday off, think about it, come back Monday." I went back Monday just as determined to quit school. And he said, I can't sign that. You're going to need to get somebody else to sign that because I believe in you. And he said, "Here's what we'll do. I'll give you whatever tutoring you need. My door is always open, whether it's about the curriculum or about personal stuff." And then he said something. And what's interesting about it, Fred, is that I heard the theme of what Gus gave me on the park bench 3 years earlier, which is there's more to you than you can see. And so instead of me dropping out of college and going back to who knows what, potential relapse and back to the streets, I ended up sort of coming out of that nosedive and doing extremely well.
I love the part of the story as to who presented your certificate to you.
Yeah, well, when I walked across the stage, both of us had something in our eye, because there was that professor who believed in me.
Yeah.
And sitting in the front row when I walked off that stage with Mom.
Yeah.
That's why I say, it's really easy to get caught up in your own PR and think you're all that in a bag of chips some days. But I got to remember every single day of all of those players in my life that really helped support me. And I think it's also important for us as parents, as leaders, as managers, as community people, that we have the power to have that influence on other people's lives. And there's probably people that you've influenced that you don't even know you've influenced.
Yeah.
I don't think Gus, he's likely not alive now, knows the impact that 7-minute interaction he had with me really was. And I know Scott McLeod, Constable Scott McLeod, OPP, didn't know the impact he had on my life until I wrote him a letter and said, "Thanks."
Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
And sometimes we don't know the way the recipient of those things, we'll take it. Quick story to really amplify what you're saying. I sent a letter to a school teacher who had a huge influence on me, a high school teacher at the Midland High School, and I never heard anything from this person. I'd see him occasionally. He kind of didn't make eye contact with me, and I thought, I don't know what's going on here. Like I told him he'd changed the course of my life. After he died, his son contacted me, and he said, my dad only had one piece of paper on his dresser, the letter that I'd written to him.
Yeah.
So sometimes neither side understands the impact that it has. Let me go ahead.
If you think about it, we are the sum of about 5 to 7 people. Sometimes it's mom and dad, but a lot of times it isn't. It's uncle, it's coach, it's teacher, it's friend. And the impact those people have in our lives change who we are and change the trajectory of who we are.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to give people the exercise of count your 5. But think about it, you're probably on someone's list. And you don't even know that interaction. That's why I always look for those opportunities, whether it's a Kool-Aid stand with a young person to encourage their entrepreneurship, or just a kind word to someone when it feels right, and to not hold back that interaction, because I know how powerful they can be in taking someone.
That's a great message for our viewers, and thank you for that. That's very special. Well, let's get you into the working world now. Your sort of mantra is from Skid Row to CEO. We've done the Skid Row. How do we get to be CEO?
Well, I graduated and decided to go back to Vancouver. My brother lived in BC, so I called him up and said, hey, can I come out and stay on your couch for a week? He said, sure, come on out. We'll smoke cigars and watch NASCAR. And so I jumped in my 82 Honda Civic and put it on the back of a U-Haul, went across the country. I had 5 years sobriety at a college education. I knocked on his door. His wife answered. It was in that moment I realized he didn't tell her I was coming. But anyways, it all worked out. And she got me a job interview at Minolta, Canada, selling copiers and fax, which I thought was the greatest job in the world. It was pure commission. You eat what you kill, and I got a box of business card, and I was cut out in the street. And here's what's interesting. I went out and I absolutely nailed it. And I remember being interviewed by a business publication. Maybe it was the Board of Trade. I can't remember. But they said, you've been successful because in spite of being homeless. And I said, I'm successful because I was homeless. That transferable skills. I had the gift of gab, the ability to communicate with people. I had a deep sense of empathy, which is really important in business development and sales. And I knew how to solve problems that didn't have solutions. When the pandemic hit, I found myself in familiar territory, because I know what it's like to go to bed with worry and fear and anxiety and feel unsafe and being disconnected from family and resources and waking up in the morning with problems that don't have solutions. And so business was easy. It was simple. I looked at it all and it was like I could see through the matrix.
Yeah.
And in a short period of time, I did Minolta, everything I could there. And then I started a small company with a friend. And in less than 12 years, I remember walking into the office one day and sitting on my desk is a copy of Canadian Business. And I was on the cover of it as an entrepreneur.
Wow.
Wow. So
that's going 180 degrees, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But the thing is that the one question I get asked all the time is, well, what was your secret? I don't know. I woke up earlier than other people. There is no secret to success. You put one foot in front of the other and you apply yourself. I think the greatest thing, especially now, is to keep your feet moving in the face of negative emotion.
Yeah.
If there's one thing I'll own, is that I was tenacious.
Yeah.
Is that even though I was afraid, I kept my feet moving.
Yeah.
And when you do that, guess what you find? You find what Gus pointed to, which is the more to you that you can't see. But you'll never find it if you do not get up off the bench and take steps forward. Inside each and every one of us is an unlimited, untapped potential. The tragedy of life isn't that it ends too soon, it's that we wait too long to begin it because of fear. If you only knew what you could accomplish.
Yeah.
Jimmy Pattison, when he was 70, said something like, if I only knew how successful I was going to be back in my 20s, I would have applied myself, or something to that effect. And I find that fascinating because Jimmy Patterson's a relatively successful Canadian entrepreneur.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah, you kind of think, yeah, Jimmy kind of knocked it out of the park. But
Pretty well.
I find that interesting, that mindset.
Yeah.
How many years did he hold himself? Yeah.
Now, you had some illness along the way. Is that during the time you were pursuing your entrepreneurial success?
Yeah, I was kind of in the middle. It actually helped me shift a lot of perspective. In 2001, I was diagnosed with diverticulitis, ended up in the hospital, had a ileostomy and a colostomy, so I had a bag on both sides. I got MRSA, and I come very, very close to losing my life. And I think a lot of that, when I got out of the hospital and I managed to heal up and move forward, it really caused me to take a second look at what was important, in my life. A few years later, in 2003, my daughter was born, and around this time, I decided to exit my position in the corporate world in the company I was running, to do something that had more meaning and purpose for me, which was professional speaking and training and working with youth and talking to kids in schools and stuff. And so I started a foundation, wrote a book, and got busy. But yeah, the illness was a real, I think, it happens to us in our late 30s and our 40s where you start to ask the question of legacy, what's really important. And I also promoted myself to my level of incompetence in my own company. And that's why it's funny. They call me the Skid Row CEO, but I'm not really a CEO, I was a business development guy who managed to be successful in an entrepreneurial effort, but I wasn't particularly good at the management stuff.
Yeah.
I was good at vision, but not good at day-to-day operations.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes an effective, senior level person. And so at that point, that's when I sort of pulled the pin, and I'm going to go and do this other work that has a little bit more juice connected to my purpose and passion.
Joe, at this point, it sounds like the trajectory is just onward and upward. But following your surgery, you got into a problem again.
Yeah. So the problem with adversity is it keeps you vigilant. See, there's a lot of assets that'll come out of the pandemic that are positive. We've yet to mine those, but they're good. There's actually a lot of good that's coming out of this. Not to diminish the bad side. It's when times are really good that we stop learning. And I took my eye off the recovery ball, so to speak.
Yeah.
And was given some over-the-counter or prescription pain medication, which I then began abusing. So technically, I had relapsed. And I was in this form of denial, and that continued to snowball. But it became apparent that after a few weeks that this was a fairly serious problem, which turned into a full-blown relapse into alcohol and drugs. Now, I didn't end up on the street because by this time in my life, I'd acquired a little bit of money, so I had some means. But it was just as emotionally and physically devastating. It's just that I didn't end up sleeping on concrete again. Fortunately for me, I turned that around and went back, into recovery, and I've been sober again since.
And your support friends played quite a role in that too, in terms of suggesting the direction you go.
Yeah, well, what was interesting about my recovery is I held it like an asset. So I had 12 years sober, and I treated that like a thing.
Yeah.
And what I realized in that process is the only one who cared about that was me.
Yeah.
Nobody cared that I was sober 12 years or 2 days. They just didn't want to see me die.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so these people loved me where I was at unconditionally. And that's one of the things I love about the recovery community is that, it's a community of people that'll love me when I'm not able to love myself.
Yeah. Joe, you then, you mentioned that you'd gotten into motivational speaking, and an event occurred at an Aeroplan conference that was another trajectory point for you. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So it took a lot of corporate courage to do this. And COO at the time was a gentleman named Kevin O'Brien. And they put together this program where they wanted a speaker with lived experience to come and talk about youth homelessness and to take the entire company through 3 exercises: food scarcity, panhandling, money scarcity, and sleeping outside, like a camp out, to talk about housing scarcity. And they asked if I would do it. And I said, I'd be grateful to come and speak. And to their delight, I said, I'm also willing to go through all the exercises with you. And what happened over the course of a 24-hour period is we did, successfully execute these 3 exercises, had them make sandwiches. The 450 folks made sandwiches and, really learned and understood food scarcity for kids in the streets. Then we had an agreement with the subway authority in Montreal, where they actually went into the subway stations in groups of 10. There was like 30 or 40 groups that went. The interesting thing about this is we thought they were going to fail. In fact, the entire operation was set up for them to fail, but they came back with, I think, $15,000 in change. It was incredible. And then, yeah, it was so inspiring. And then the third thing was to have them sleep outside, to actually get a feel of what would that be like. Now, all of this was geared to support Dans la Rue, which is a youth charity in the city of Montreal that supports the over 5,000 young people that are on the streets. Over the course of that period, I became so inspired. And the biggest thing I heard the next day was, Joe, I'll never look at this issue the same. Yeah. And so I walked away inspired, but I also walked away connected to that promise I made way back on that street corner to do something to pay it forward.
Yeah.
And that day that I'd sold my boots, I said, I'll make good on the opportunity and I'll do something to help others. And so there was something gnawing at me that came out of this event. And I remember ruminating on that for the next couple of weeks. But one of the most inspiring pieces of work that I had ever done.
And it led to probably one of the pinnacles of your life.
Yeah. So I'm on an airplane ride about 3 weeks after this, and I was talking with my business partner at the time, Dr. Sean Richardson, and I said, Sean, this thing that we did with Aeroplan and the way we inspired people and the way they got active and involved and the way they changed the way they think about this really important issue that's not just in Montreal, it's right across the country. So what can we do to raise awareness? And Sean says, well, Sean, he's a former Olympic athlete. He was a rower, and he's also a sports psychologist. He says, well, why don't you run across Canada? I says, why don't you run across Canada? At the time, I was 280 pounds and a self-proclaimed non-athlete. I'm going to run into the store. But he says, no. He says, you can do it, Joe. And I said, well, I'm not running. He said, okay, walk. And I said, well, what would make it different? He says, why don't you push a shopping cart? It's a symbol of chronic homelessness.
Yeah. Yeah.
The shopping cart is the outcome you're trying to avoid for every kid. It's your story, Joe. And I remember, Fred, that the hair on the back of my neck just, it was a wild enough thing that it got me excited. And so over the next, several weeks, we sort of began planting and planning and plotting and sort of marinating on what this, walk across Canada would actually look like. And yeah.
So I was fascinated reading the book, the preparations. Like, I don't even know how I would approach a 9,000 kilometer walk, but the preparations that you made, the successes and the failures in terms of getting it all together, was fascinating. Just give us a couple of examples of some of the stuff that had to come together to make this happen.
Well, we needed a shopping cart, and we, I wasn't going to go to Zehrs or Superstore or Canadian Tire, because every time I go, I always get the cart with the tire that doesn't work.
I know. I can't push one straight through the aisle.
Yeah, and I pushed a real shopping cart around the inner city, Fred. There's no way I'm pushing one through Saskatchewan or Northern Ontario in the winter. So we knew we needed a unique cart. So we got kids from a local high school. Again, what we did through this entire campaign is we went to people who we thought might have an answer for us and employed them. This is what you do in business. Hire people that are smarter than you. Go talk to people or analyze or deconstruct something that's already been built that works and then figure it out, sort of reverse engineer it. these kids said to us, well, don't use a shopping cart, use a baby carriage. And we went, oh, it's genius. Take a baby carriage and so there we had one of our problems solved. But there was so many other things. You know, we went and we interviewed the 2010 Olympics torch committee, because that was a trek across Canada. These people understood, and they were more than happy to help us. We went and we talked to people at the Rick Hansen Foundation, who had just finished their 25-year anniversary relay, and talked to them and listened. And then I thought, well, I'm going to need to get in shape. So in the summer of 2012, I walked from Calgary to Vancouver with our newly created shopping cart. And we found an abundance of people who were willing to help us. And so what that trial taught us was, one, that I was able to physically do this. That was 1,100 kilometers through 6 mountain ranges. So I knew we could do it. But over the course of the next 3 years, we had literally 10,000 problems that we had to solve. But by taking the steps forward, we basically paved the road as we went. And we discovered, once again, what Gus said, which is there's more to you than you can see. If you keep your feet moving, you'll figure it out as you go. But there was a trainload of uncertainty and problems that we had to navigate, like big problems, but we got it done.
Three of them that I'd like you to just, and we're kind of running out of time, but there were three of them that fascinated me. So if you can do this fairly quickly, you needed an RV.
Yeah, we needed an RV. We had learned about a previous campaign that had used Fraser Way RV. So we went to Fraser Way and we met with James Epp, who's the CEO, and we explained our cause. And James says, no problem, we'll help you. And because he understood what we were trying to do and who we were doing it for.
Right.
And so his heart was connected. Not only did he give us the RV for the trial, he then gave us an RV for the national campaign, wow, which was the loan of $100,000 RV for 18 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
The driver.
Oh, Bobby McGee, who drove the RV. So there's this guy on Facebook. He keeps going, hey, I love what you're doing. Hey, I love what you're doing. And his name is Rob Cook. Well, I don't know who Rob Cook is, right? And so then I said, thanks. I kept saying, thank you, because he kept giving me, showering these compliments. And I said, so then finally I said, do we know each other? And he went, it's Cooter. And all of a sudden I realized this is the guy I used to know from the downtown east side, who was also sober and a professional driver. I says, how would you like a job? And he says, I'd love it. And so he was our trial driver. And then, yeah, we hired him for the full campaign to go across the country. But again, that was just one that came out of the ether.
That's
right?
A great story.
Yeah.
Videographer.
Ali Verk. So we knew that we needed media from the trial track in order to get sponsorship for the national track.
Yeah.
So the one thing we budgeted for was to make sure we had somebody who was capturing all this stuff so we could do a documentary or video material. Ali Verk came out of the Vancouver Film School. We emailed the Vancouver Film School and said, hey, have you got a student that want to help us? And they said, well, our students it's not how it works, but what we can do is connect you with previous grads. And so we asked Ali if he would like to work for almost free and go from Vancouver or from Calgary to Vancouver in an RV with a couple of altruistic guys trying to change youth homelessness in Canada. And he was a gamer. He said, yeah, I would love to do that.
Now, there's a certain sort of a recurrence to some of the characters in your story. I mean, your mom keeps popping up at important times. The story of Cooter, I just love. But there was a woman who took an interest in what you were doing. Somebody named Marie.
Oh, yeah. So during the trial, my life, I was going through a lot of changes in my personal life. My first marriage was coming to a close. And out of the blue, I think it was somewhere halfway between Calgary and Vancouver on the trial track, I get this email. And I can't believe it. It's I'm reading this email, and I remember reading it to Cooter, to Rob, and he couldn't believe it. And anyways, a short story is that the person who found me happened to have Googled me 28 years later, and it was the girl from grade 10. It was my high school sweetheart.
Yeah, isn't that great?
And so we started to correspond. And I need to say, like, it wasn't romantic at all. It was just kind of like, hey, how are you doing? Which happened a lot to me because I've been featured a lot in the media. So I've met and reconnected with lots of people from my early childhood, from my high school. And so we agreed 3 months later when I was in Toronto to have lunch, and we did. And subsequently after that, we stayed in touch, and things sort of grew and bloomed from there. And we ended up falling in love. And 2 months before the Push for Change kicked off, we made it official and we got married up at the Briars, up on Lake Simcoe.
Yeah, yeah.
But here's what else is amazing is that Marie ended up becoming the campaign director for the Cross Canada Walk. And I'm not saying this because we share our life as husband and wife, but there was no better person on earth to do this job than Marie. Yeah. She is a career accountant, incredibly organized, knows how to operationalize anything, incredibly organized, built systems, and ran the thing like a well-run engine. And I've never worked with anybody quite like her. And again, I don't say that because we share our life as husband and wife, because she's an exceptional person to work with.
She showed that my contact with you was through her.
Yeah.
And she was just so well organized. I sent her a note this morning thanking her because she did such a great job at facilitating what we're doing right now. So thank her again for me.
I will.
You mentioned a daughter, and I know you're very proud of her. How old is she now?
She's 17. She'll be 18 on the 10th of October.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, and her name is Lauren. And, I was always worried about Lauren, as any parent is. We fret and we fear, and we find out our kids are smoking pot or they're hanging around with, and there's always this fear because we see what can happen in the world, and having firsthand experience of knowing, how quickly that was always. And so I did my real best as a dad to teach her to keep her feet moving, that we live in an effort-based world. To teach her the stuff that, Carol Dweck talks about, which is, growth versus fixed mindset. And she's grown up to be a remarkable young woman. And just about a month and a half ago, she got accepted into University of British Columbia. And you'll be proud to know that one of her aspirations is to one day become a lawyer.
Oh, good for her.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
That's exciting. Wow.
She was also a huge ambassador. She was a huge ambassador in the campaign too. She was that youth voice that we needed.
Great.
And she watched the whole thing sort of, she took part in many places across the country, but obviously she stayed home base because of school and stability for her. But yeah.
Joe, I want to encourage our viewers to read the book, Push for Change. You and Marie, you authored it. She co-authored with you. We don't have time right now to go through the whole, and it's a fascinating story, 9,000 miles across their kilometers across the country. But I'll leave that for our viewers to read in the book. But I do want to double back and ask you about some of the themes that have emerged from our conversation, and maybe just drill a little deeper on those if that's okay. Homelessness, there's a lot that leads to homelessness, and you've really developed some expertise on that. In just a few moments, can you share some of your views on homelessness with us?
Well, I think first of all, when we say homelessness, we're actually talking about 50 different things. Okay. And we label it as homelessness. Homelessness is mental health, early childhood trauma, generational trauma. And homelessness is different in different communities. It's different in Midland than it is in St. Catharines than it is in Kenora. And I think that the thing that we were fighting for in our walk across Canada was really to create collaboration and resources to people who are vulnerable. So whether that child needs mental health, addiction support, needs rehousing because their housing environment is good, it's being able to access and get individuals the resources they need. It's not just about housing. It's about supportive services. My story is a story of what happens when it goes well. I got access to alcohol and drug treatment, housing, education, and went back out and reintegrated back in the world. But I think that that collaboration to get people the resources they need is absolutely crucial if we're ever going to get to a place where we prevent, reduce, and end youth homelessness or any homelessness, homelessness in general, right across the entire country.
Joe, when we chatted a week or so ago, you made some comments about the resiliency of young people, and I'd like you to share that with our viewers.
Well, I think that one of the greatest opportunities with young people is that, first of all, we know that 4 out of 5 adult homelessness experienced homelessness as a youth, right? And that is our greatest opportunity if we want to really put a dent in the bigger picture on homelessness, because if we can get young people the support they need at a young age, we can change the trajectory of their lives, right? If we do nothing, then we'll just continue to see young people fall through the cracks. And I've spoken to over 2 million people, and so many people come up to me and say, if I didn't have my dad, or if I didn't have that soccer team, or if I didn't have that basketball coach. So most of us have been fortunate enough to have those good things in our lives, that when things got rough, when we were 15, 16, 17, 18, there was someone there to help steer us in the right direction. Unfortunately, not all childhood and not all children's lives are created equal. And I think it's incumbent upon us as a nation to support those kids where we can, so they don't fall through the cracks. And that's about collaboration and access to resources.
Yeah. Addiction. It's very clear from reading your book that you view addiction as a health issue, as a mental health issue. Can you just share a few words on that? We're very close to our end here.
Yeah, I think that the best way I can do it is a metaphor. You would never think of a Canadian walking into a hospital with diabetes or heart disease or stroke and being judged for how they live their life. Mm-hmm. Addiction is a health issue. And the sooner we stop judging it and start treating it, the quicker we can turn around some of the great problems that we have to deal with the opioid crisis. But it's really about supporting supporting individuals, and it's the same model, supporting individuals and getting them the resources they need. It's a more complex problem, but if you look at societies like Portugal, who have really taken this on as a health crisis in their country and pivoted, that's where I think the solutions lie.
Great. Joe, I'm going to take a minute and thank some folks, and then I'm going to come back and thank you. First of all, to our viewers, thanks so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I have learned a lot from Joe Roberts, and I encourage you to have a look for his book, Push for Change. I want to thank our technical support folks at Rogers Community Television, who continue to support us. Thanks to the staff at the Midland Cultural Center, particularly to Michelle Thibodeau, who is the coordinator of marketing and programming and who helps us to make you aware of the programs that we're putting on. I want to thank Kathy Bales, Michelle Deschamps, Jeff Holloway at RBC Dominion Securities for their season sponsorship, and the law firm HGR Graham Partners for their sponsorship of this program. Joe, this has been great. You are an inspiration. I mean, I said to you when we began that our program is about inspiration. You, my friend, are about inspiration. Thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful hour.